Greater protein intake, the greater grip strength in our sample here. The interesting thing here, though, is that of our sample here, it showed that protein was significantly lower than the reference range for adults. Additionally, and again, given our findings, non-surprisingly, we found that women's grip strength was significantly lower in the vegetarians and vegans as compared to the national standard. So overall, we did find a significant association between peak grip strength and protein intake, but what we would recommend is for an increased protein intake in vegetarians and vegans.
Fascinating. What do you think, I guess, should be so instead of 0.8 grams per kilogram, what do you think it might be for a vegan or vegetarian that might better improve their opportunity to get an optimal protein?
Well, off the top of my head, I would recommend to increase protein intake to at least 1 gram per kilogram per day.
That sounds sensible.
Yeah, so at least 1 gram per kilogram, possibly a little bit more, but then again, it's going to be very dependent on your lifestyle, your activity level, stuff like that. Obviously, if you're active, you're going to be wanting to have more protein per day as well.
So this was in an inactive population.
Correct.
And so do you think there might be a future study on an active population?
Definitely, we could go that direction. What I would actually like to do is do a study where we have an intervention, because what we did is we actually did have an intervention here, and what they consumed was a mung bean protein patty that was basically a vegan egg patty. And unfortunately, we had a lot of attrition during this feeding study, over 50% attrition. So what we're hoping to do is possibly another study where we do an intervention with possibly something like a soy protein or something that is possibly more palatable, more acceptable.
I see. So my question is, do you know what the protein, I mean, just subjectively, if it's anecdotal, what were some of the common sources of protein that this particular inactive population consumed, or that maybe they were consuming?
So a lot of whole foods based sources, right? Just a lot of fruits, vegetables. What we did find is there was, a fair amount of people that did have a good varied diet, and then of course there were some people that had more of what would you consider a junk food diet, right?
Oh wow, the vegan junk food,
the vegan junk
caveat.
Food, yes, exactly. And we found people, on both ends of the spectrum. But what we did find, kind of overall in general, was that they had a pretty high quality diet. As far as being balanced and whatnot, we just found, unfortunately, that it was significantly lower than the reference in protein.
Yes, and their strength was a little lower too than the references.
Correct. Yes.
Okay. Cool. Thank you very much, Eric.
Thanks a lot.
Appreciate it. So this study really caught my attention because I'm a cyclist, and this year I made some adjustments. I got a clock and GoPro on my bike. So we're here with
John Mercer.
John Mercer. I'm Yvonne. Nice to meet you.
Yvonne, nice to meet you.
So we were just talking off camera. Could you explain to me what this apparatus is on the bike and what you were looking for and what you found?
Sure. So we're really interested in field testing of rolling resistance and CDA, but right now we're really focused in on rolling resistance that's provided by the tire. And so what we have is a device that actually measures a number of things that we put on the front of the bike. It measures wind resistance, GPS data, temperature data, and using all those metrics combined with the power that you get from a regular power meter, we can start to get a sense of what CDA is as well as what CR, rolling resistance, they're provided. Where we're going with this project is we're interested in how rolling resistance in the real world comes out, and we're interested in factors like how wide the wheel is, how wide the tire is, and the tire pressure. We're interested in those three things, how they interplay with each other in figuring out rolling resistance. And we're looking at the influence of different tire pressures on rolling resistance. And what was really interesting is, historically, we want to try to pump our tires up high.
Right.
So 120 psi.
Right.
That's what I always used to do.
Yeah, that's what I'm always told. Yeah.
Now what we're finding is that rolling resistance is lower when we start dropping down that pressure.
Okay.
And so for this project, we looked at 3 pressures: 100 psi, 70 psi, and 40 psi. And what we identified was that the rolling resistance was lower for the 70 psi, but higher for 100 psi or 40 psi. 40 psi is like, you know, your tire is going flat.
Yeah.
And that makes it harder to ride. What's interesting is the higher pressure also makes it harder to ride because the tire doesn't deform as well over the bumps. And so every time the tire hits a bump, it basically, if the tire pressure is too high, it will lift the whole wheel up. And that's even though it's just a small amount, it will accumulate a lot over a bumpy course.
But if it was a course without bumps, would you think that would be the same situation? Or
Yeah, totally different.
Totally different.
If the course is super smooth, a hard cement, well, now maybe that's going to influence where that lowest rolling resistance will actually happen. And the harder the surface, the smoother the surface, probably the higher the pressure would be better.
Okay.
But for most of the roads that we're out riding on, probably moving down lower is actually better in terms of PSI.
No, I love hearing that because this is a sweet spot based on and what was the road like in this particular condition? It was like a typical.
Yeah, this was a bike path in Las Vegas.
Was it pretty bumpy or?
Not bumpy to the point where you say it's bumpy, but it's a very comfortable bike path to ride.
Right.
Typical asphalt, but not a lot of chip seal. So.
Yeah, but in that case, you still found lower rolling
PSI,
resistance here. Yeah.
And so some of the other tests that we're doing, that PSI actually moves up closer to 80, depending on the wheel width, the tire width, and the tire pressure.
Was this a road bike or was this
is a gravel bike? Actually.
Gravel bike.
Yeah,
okay.
so we used a gravel bike because you can change the width of the wheels really easily
I
on
see.
a gravel bike.
Was the width of the wheels similar to like were you trying to replicate mountain bike versus road bike?
723.
Okay.
So typical road tire. But again, as we start testing tires of different width, it will change this picture.
Yes.
And that's the next project that we'll have out there.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I'm really fascinated with this,
Awesome.
especially the
Thanks for
rolling
stopping by.
resistance. Yeah. So this is a very intriguing study where they looked at brain activity in cyclists, like novices versus long-term cycling athletes, like people who have cycling expertise, and they find that expertise impacts the subcortical and prefrontal brain areas during cycling, and that regular practice of cycling may enhance neural regulation of cognitive, motor, and homeostatic resources during exercise at different intensities, which may help explain the higher performance of cycling athletes. But this is truly a fascinating study. They took an MRI, looked at the brain activity of these two groups, and they found that cycling experience led to improvements in brain activity that were associated with better performance or suggestive. So that's truly fascinating.